I learned the hard way that a patch of black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers could be considered an act of war. It all started because I believe a yard should be more than just a green carpet of perfectly manicured, chemically dependent grass. I run a landscaping and property maintenance business, a small one, just me and a couple of seasonal guys. We do everything from laying patios to plowing snow. For my own property, however, I wanted something different. I wanted a piece of the wild, a slice of the prairie that once covered this land before the developers came with their blueprints and bulldozers. So, over a few years, I cultivated a large section of my front yard into a wildflower meadow. It was my passion project, a riot of color from spring to fall that hummed with the sound of bees and fluttered with monarch butterflies drawn to the milkweed I'd planted just for them. Our neighborhood, Maple Creek Estates, had always been a live-and-let-live sort of place. The Homeowners Association was more of a formality than a force. It existed to manage the snow removal contract for the private roads and maintain the little patch of green with the gazebo at the entrance. The meetings were sparsely attended, usually just old Mr. Henderson trying to get the budget passed so he could go back to his woodworking. We paid our dues, nobody parked a broken-down car on their lawn for months on end, and life was peaceable. My meadow was, if anything, a local curiosity. People would slow their cars to look. Neighbors on their evening walks would stop and ask me about the different flowers. It was a point of connection, a conversation starter. Then Brenda moved in. She bought the house directly across the street from me, a big colonial that had been for sale for a while. From the moment her moving truck arrived, she carried herself with an air of authority, as if she were an inspector arriving to assess a failing institution. She was a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a wardrobe of sensible but expensive-looking pantsuits, and a gaze that seemed to constantly be measuring and judging. Within 3 months, she'd not only joined the HOA board, she'd somehow gotten herself elected president. Mr. Henderson, tired of the whole affair, had gladly stepped down, and Brenda, with her talk of protecting property values and enforcing community standards, had swept into the power vacuum. The changes started small, almost laughably so. First came the email memo about trash receptacles. They could no longer be visible from the street, except on collection day itself. Then came the decree on mailbox uniformity. Everyone had to have the same model of black, post-mounted mailbox, purchased from a specific supplier. A flurry of other rules followed, each more specific and arbitrary than the last. Holiday decorations could not be erected before December 1st and had to be removed by January 5th. No basketball hoops could be left at the curb. The official shade of white for trim paint was specified by its Pant 1 color code. People grumbled. They complained to each other over their fences and in the grocery store aisle, but for the most part, they complied. It was easier than fighting. It was just a mailbox, after all. I complied, too. I built a neat little cedar enclosure for my trash cans and ordered the approved mailbox. I preferred to keep my head down and my conflicts minimal. I had a business to run. I didn't have time for petty neighborhood politics. I figured her reign of micromanagement couldn't last. I was wrong. It was just the opening salvo in what would become a full-fledged campaign. The inciting incident, the moment our Cold War turned hot, happened on a sweltering Saturday in late July. The meadow was at its peak. Waves of yellow, purple, and white swayed in the breeze. It was, to my eyes, a masterpiece of natural beauty. I was on my front porch, enjoying a cold glass of iced tea and the buzz of happy pollinators, when I saw Brenda march across the street. She wasn't strolling, she was marching, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. She stopped at the edge of my property line, her feet planted firmly on the sidewalk, and stared at my meadow with a look of profound disgust. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and carrying easily across the lawn. "I need to have a word with you." I set down my glass and walked over, wiping a bit of sweat from my brow. "Morning, Brenda. Something I can help you with?" I kept my tone friendly, neighborly. No sense escalating things before they even started. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on her clipboard. "I'm here in my official capacity as president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. We have received numerous complaints about the state of your property. I glanced around. My lawn, the part that wasn't meadow, was neatly trimmed. The edges were sharp. The shrubs were pruned. Numerous complaints? About what, exactly? She gestured toward the meadow with a sweep of her clipboard, as if indicating a chemical spill. About this overgrown mess. It is in clear violation of Bylaw Section 7, Article 4, which states that all yards must be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion. This is an unkempt, uncontrolled growth of weeds. I had to stop myself from laughing. It was so patently absurd. Brenda, these aren't weeds. This is a cultivated wildflower meadow. They're native perennials. It's good for the environment. The bees, the butterflies, they love it. She was unmoved. Her expression was a mask of stern disapproval. I don't care if the Queen of England herself comes to visit them. It looks terrible, it lowers the property values of your neighbors, and more importantly, it is a fire hazard. That was the word she latched onto. The one she would use as her primary weapon. A fire hazard. I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. Brenda, we've had 3 inches of rain this month. Everything is green and lush. How on earth is this a fire hazard? In the late season, it will dry out, she snapped, her logic already jumping months ahead to justify her present position. It becomes tinder. It's irresponsible. It's a threat to the entire community. The board has voted. You have 14 days to bring your property into compliance. That means mowing this down and planting grass. If you fail to comply, you will be fined $100 per day. My attempt at reason was met with a wall of bureaucratic dogma. I tried to explain the ecological principles, the difference between a curated meadow and a patch of dead thistle. She wasn't listening. She saw something that didn't conform to her vision of a perfect, sterile suburb, and she was determined to eradicate it. That's not going to happen, Brenda, I said, my voice now firm. There's nothing in the bylaws that prohibits a wildflower meadow. The bylaws state a neat and orderly. She shot back, her voice dripping with condescension. That is a subjective term, and the board, which I lead, is the arbiter of that subjectivity. This is not neat. This is not orderly. This is chaos. She gave a curt nod, turned on her heel, and marched back across the street, leaving me standing there by my beautiful, chaotic, and apparently dangerously flammable meadow. The threat had been delivered. The lines were drawn, not in the sand, but in the soil right there at my feet. For the first week, I did nothing. I assumed it was a bluff, an overreach of her newfound power that she would eventually walk back once she realized how ridiculous it was. I was a respected member of the community. I plowed half the neighborhood's driveways in the winter. I helped Mrs. Gable down the street with her garden beds every spring, free of charge. I wasn't some troublemaker. Surely, common sense would prevail. On the 15th day, a certified letter arrived. It was a formal notice of violation, complete with a photograph of my meadow and the first $100 fine. The conflict began to escalate. I wrote a formal letter back to the HOA board, respectfully declining to pay the fine and outlining my position. I explained, in calm and rational terms, the environmental benefits of my meadow, and I quoted the section of the bylaws she had mentioned, arguing that neat and orderly could not reasonably be interpreted to mean grass only. I even included a list of the native species planted and a few articles from ecological journals. I was trying to meet absurdity with reason. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The response I received a week later was a second fine, this one for $200, which included the original fine plus the accumulated daily penalties. The accompanying letter, signed by Brenda, stated that my appeal had been reviewed by the board and denied. It went on to say that my continued defiance would result in further action, including placing a lien on my property. That got my attention. A lien was serious business. It could affect my credit, my ability to get a loan for my business. This petty tyrant was no longer just an annoyance, she was a direct threat to my livelihood. The situation started to affect others. My immediate neighbor, Arthur, a retired history professor in his 70s, was firmly on my side. He loved the meadow. He'd often sit on his porch with his binoculars, watching the goldfinches feast on the coneflower seeds. But he told me others were nervous. Brenda had made it clear during an impromptu sidewalk lecture to another resident that anyone seen publicly supporting non-compliant properties might find their own homes under increased scrutiny. It was a classic tactic of intimidation, and it was working. People who had once complimented my yard now averted their eyes when I drove past. They were afraid of being next on Brenda's list. The most heartbreaking victim of her crusade was Mrs. Gable. She was an 84-year-old widow who had lived in her small house for 50 years. Her greatest joy was feeding the birds. She had several feeders in her backyard, and Brenda, citing a rule about attracting vermin, had ordered her to take them down. When Mrs. Gable, a woman who had survived a war and raised 3 children on her own, had politely refused, the fine started. She called me one afternoon, her voice trembling. She'd just received a bill for $500 from the HOA. She was on a fixed income. She didn't know what to do. That was the moment my frustration solidified into cold, hard resolve. This wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about a bully using a thin veneer of authority to terrorize vulnerable people. It was about the corrosion of a once friendly community. Brenda had weaponized the HOA, turning it from a simple service organization into her own private fiefdom. I told Mrs. Gable not to pay a cent, and that I would handle it. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't let it stand. I realized I was out of my depth. I was a landscaper, not a lawyer. Trying to fight Brenda on her own terms, through the very rules she was twisting to her advantage, was a losing game. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer in town, a man named Mr. Davies who specialized in real estate and contract law. He had a reputation for being sharp, thorough, and not particularly cheap. I sat in his mahogany-paneled office, a file folder with the HOA letters, the bylaws, and photos of my meadow on the polished table between us. Mr. Davies, a man with graying temples and a calm, analytical demeanor, listened patiently as I laid out the entire story, from Brenda's election to the fines against Mrs. Gable. He reviewed the documents, occasionally letting out a low hum of contemplation. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. "Well," he began, "you're in a classic HOA dispute. These situations can be incredibly frustrating and expensive. The core of the issue is the subjective language in the bylaws. Neat and orderly can mean whatever the board decides it means, and unless their interpretation is completely outrageous, courts are often reluctant to interfere with the decisions of a private association's elected board, so she can just do this." I asked, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. "She can fine an old woman into poverty for feeding birds." "Not necessarily," Mr. Davies said, holding up a hand. "Her power isn't absolute. There are avenues. We can sue, arguing that the board's interpretation is arbitrary and capricious, and that they are engaging in selective enforcement. But it's a long, costly fight, and the outcome is never guaranteed. She has the HOA's funds to fight you with, which means you're essentially paying for her lawyer to fight your lawyer." He let that sink in. "However," he continued, "the best way to fight a bureaucracy is not always head-on. The best way is to find a bigger bureaucracy it has to answer to, or to find a rule that trumps all of their rules." That was the piece of advice that stuck with me. A bigger bureaucracy. A trump card. He told me the first step was to gather information. Every piece of paper related to the HOA, the original development plans for Maple Creek Estates, the county land records, everything. "Go on a fishing expedition," he advised. "You never know what you'll find in the fine print. These associations often get sloppy over the years. They forget things. They fail to file paperwork. Look for a mistake. Look for leverage." I left his office with a hefty bill for the consultation, but also with a clear strategy. I was no longer just defending my meadow, I was launching a counter-offensive. That evening, I started my investigation. The HOA was legally required to make its records available to homeowners, so I sent a formal, certified letter requesting copies of all meeting minutes, financial statements, and contracts for the past 10 years. Brenda couldn't legally refuse, though the packet of documents I eventually received was disorganized, with several pages clearly missing. For the next few weeks, my evenings were spent at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of paper. I read through years of mind-numbingly dull meeting minutes, tracing Brenda's swift consolidation of power. I scrutinized the financial records. The budget had ballooned since she took over. The line item for landscaping and beautification had nearly tripled, yet the only visible change was a new set of perfectly spaced, HOA-approved petunias at the front entrance. The line for legal and administrative fees had also mysteriously grown. It was suspicious, but it wasn't a smoking gun. It was her word against mine. My real breakthrough came from a different direction entirely. Following Mr. Davies's advice, I went to the county records office, a dusty building downtown with shelves of heavy binders and the faint smell of old paper. I wanted to see the original plat map and covenants for Maple Creek Estates, filed back in the late 1970s when the subdivision was first carved out of farmland. I spent a whole afternoon scrolling through microfiche, my eyes burning from the strain. I found the original covenants, which were much simpler than the bloated set of rules Brenda was enforcing. But tucked into the file, almost as an afterthought, was a separate document. It was titled, Conservation Easement and Land Management Grant Agreement with the State Department of Environmental Resources. My heart started to beat a little faster. I carefully read the dense, legalistic text. The document was an agreement between the original developer and the state. In exchange for grant money to help with the development of drainage systems and green spaces, the developer had agreed to place a conservation easement on all designated common areas and encourage environmentally beneficial landscaping throughout the subdivision. The agreement was binding on all future homeowners and their governing association. It was a permanent covenant tied to the land itself. I kept reading, my excitement growing. The agreement didn't just encourage good practices, it mandated them. It specifically required that a certain percentage of the common areas be maintained as a native species habitat, and then I saw the sentence that made me feel like I'd struck gold. It explicitly stated that the grant program promoted the use of xeriscaping, natural meadows, and other low-water, pro-pollinator landscaping on private lots, and that any local association rules should be interpreted liberally to permit and encourage such features. This wasn't just a trump card, it was a royal flush. Brenda's entire campaign against my meadow wasn't just a matter of her personal taste, it was a direct violation of a binding legal agreement with the state of which she was clearly, completely unaware. Her fire hazard was, in the eyes of the state, a pro-pollinator landscaping feature. Her demands that I destroy it weren't just petty, they were illegal. And the best part? The agreement laid out severe financial penalties for any party found to be in violation, payable to the state. The HOA itself could be on the hook for thousands of dollars. I paid the clerk for a dozen certified copies of the document. As I walked out of the records office into the bright afternoon sun, I felt the entire dynamic of the conflict shift. I was no longer on the defensive. I was armed. I wasn't just fighting for my flowers or for Mrs. Gable's bird feeders. I was now an agent of enforcement for a state-level environmental mandate. Brenda had picked a fight with me, a local landscaper. She was about to find out she had actually picked a fight with the State Department of Environmental Resources. My first call was to Mr. Davies. I can still remember the long, satisfied whistle he let out after I finished explaining what I'd found. "Well, I'll be," he said, a genuine smile in his voice. "You didn't just go fishing, you landed a whale. This changes everything." Our strategy session was brief and decisive. We would move from a defensive crouch to an all-out offensive. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled in 3 weeks. It was typically a sleepy affair, but I knew this year would be different. The fines, the threats, the general atmosphere of oppression had stirred the neighborhood from its apathy. I started talking to my neighbors, quietly at first. I showed Arthur the documents, and his eyes lit up with a historian's appreciation for archival discovery. He helped me spread the word. We didn't reveal the trump card, not yet. We simply encouraged everyone to attend the meeting. We told them it was time for the community to have its voice heard. My next call was to the State Department of Environmental Resources, the agency listed on the grant. I managed to get through to a program coordinator named Ms. Albright. I explained the situation. A local HOA president was actively fining a resident for maintaining a native pollinator garden, which seemed to be in direct contradiction to the terms of a grant her agency had awarded. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a very interested, "Could you repeat the name of that subdivision, please?" Ms. Albright was very helpful. She confirmed that the grant and its associated easement were still very much active. Her department conducted periodic reviews, but they were often just paperwork checks. They relied on local compliance and reporting. An HOA actively working against the grant's core purpose was a major red flag for them. I told her about the upcoming annual meeting and asked if a representative from her department might be able to attend, just to clarify the state's position on the matter. She said she would be delighted to attend. In fact, she insisted. The final piece of my investigation fell into place almost by accident. While cross-referencing the inflated landscaping and beautification invoices with the HOA's checkbook records, I noticed something odd. The payments were all going to a company I'd never heard of, Prestige Garden Solutions LLC. Out of curiosity, I looked up the company on the state's business registry. It had been formed just 4 months ago. The registered agent and sole officer listed for the company was a name I didn't recognize at first, Brenda's maiden name, which I had found on a public record search earlier. She wasn't just enforcing her aesthetic preferences, she was using HOA funds to pay a shell company owned by herself for a few overpriced petunias. She wasn't just a tyrant, she was a thief. I now had proof of both her legal incompetence and her financial corruption. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the meeting. The night of the annual meeting, the community hall was packed. I'd never seen more than 10 people at one of these things before. Tonight, there were over 100. The air was thick with a mixture of anger, anxiety, and anticipation. People were tired of being pushed around. Brenda and her 2 loyal board members, a timid-looking man and a woman who mirrored Brenda's scowl, sat at a table at the front of the room, looking slightly rattled by the massive turnout. Brenda called the meeting to order, her voice tight with forced composure. They went through the usual procedural nonsense, approving the minutes from the last meeting, a treasurer's report that was suspiciously vague. Then she opened the floor for new business. This was my cue. Before I could stand, however, Arthur got to his feet. In his calm, professorial voice, he began to question the massive budget increase. "Brenda," he said, "I notice our dues have gone up 20% this year, and our landscaping budget has tripled. Could you provide the membership with a detailed breakdown of the expenditures from this Prestige Garden Solutions?" Brenda's face flushed. "All expenditures have been approved by the board and are in accordance with the bylaws," she said dismissively. "We hired a premium service to enhance the community's curb appeal." Several people in the crowd scoffed. Another neighbor stood up to complain about the fines levied against Mrs. Gable for her bird feeders. The room began to simmer. Brenda was losing control. She banged her gavel on the table. "This is not an open forum for baseless complaints," she shouted. "There is an official agenda. Now, the next item of business is the continued non-compliance of Lot 37". She glared directly at me. "The board has voted to place a lien on this property for failure to pay over $8,000 in accumulated fines for the unapproved and hazardous landscaping." Her gasp went through the room. $8,000. It was an astronomical sum, meant to shock and intimidate. Now, it was my turn. I stood up, a file folder in my hand. Mr. Davies was seated in the back, observing. Ms. Albright from the state was there too, sitting quietly in the front row like any other resident. "Brenda," I began, my voice steady and calm, "before the board votes on any liens, I believe there is some information the entire community needs to be aware of." I walked to the front of the room. "You've repeatedly described my Wildflower meadow as a fire hazard and a violation of the bylaws. You've used this as justification to levy fines not just against me, but against other residents like Mrs. Gable for her bird feeders, all under the guise of maintaining community standards." I held up a certified copy of the county document. "This is a conservation easement and land management grant agreement, filed with the county in 1978. It is a binding legal document tied to every single property in Maple Creek Estates. It seems that in your quest to enforce the bylaws, you failed to read the legal covenants that supersede them. I let my eye sweep across the room, making eye contact with my neighbors. This document, an agreement with the State Department of Environmental Resources, doesn't just permit landscaping like my meadow, it actively encourages it. It mandates that our HOA promote, and I quote, the use of natural meadows and other low-water, pro-pollinator landscaping on private lots. It states that any HOA rules must be interpreted to allow these features. I turned my attention back to Brenda, whose face had gone from red to a pale, waxy white. So, you see, my meadow isn't a violation. It's the model of what this community is legally supposed to be encouraging. Your fines, your threats, your lien, they are not only baseless, they are illegal. You haven't been upholding the rules, Brenda. You've been actively breaking a binding covenant with the state. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brenda sputtered, That's an old document. It's irrelevant. The bylaws are what matter. Is it irrelevant? I asked, turning toward the front row. Perhaps we should ask Ms. Albright. She's the program coordinator from the State Department of Environmental Resources, and she was kind enough to join us tonight. Ms. Albright stood up, a pleasant but firm smile on her face. As she introduced herself, a wave of shock and understanding washed over the room. The authority in the room had just shifted, decisively. Thank you, she began. I can confirm that the conservation easement is very much in effect. My department takes compliance with these grants very seriously. An HOA actively fining residents for implementing the exact kind of environmentally beneficial features the grant was designed to promote is a severe violation. We will be opening a full investigation into the actions of this board, and I can assure you, the state will seek to recover any and all financial penalties prescribed in the original agreement for non-compliance. Brenda looked like she had been punched in the gut. Her authority had completely evaporated. But I wasn't finished. And while the state is investigating the board's legal compliance, I said, my voice dropping slightly, perhaps they should also look into its financial management. I held up the printout from the state business registry. Brenda, can you explain to the homeowners why you've been paying tens of thousands of dollars of our money to a landscaping company, Prestige Garden Solutions, a company for which you are the sole registered agent? That was the final blow. The room erupted. The timid man on the board looked physically ill. The other woman stared at Brenda with open-mouthed horror. The residents were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. Brenda just stood there, speechless, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her in real time. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then, she grabbed her purse, shoved past her now former allies, and fled out the side door of the community hall. The collapse was total and absolute. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the wake of Brenda's spectacular public downfall, the meeting continued in a more orderly, if stunned, fashion. An emergency vote was held. The two remaining board members resigned on the spot, and an interim board was elected, with Arthur reluctantly but dutifully agreeing to serve as the new president. Mr. Davies stepped forward and offered to provide pro bono guidance to the new board to ensure everything was handled correctly from that point on. Ms. Albright's investigation was as thorough as she had promised. The state's audit of the HOA's actions was a formality. They found the board under Brenda's leadership to be in gross violation of the conservation easement. A significant fine was levied against the HOA, but Ms. Albright, working with the new board, structured it so that the penalty was waived on the condition that the HOA implement a new set of green bylaws and use its reserve funds to establish a community garden and pollinator pathway in the common areas. It was a punishment that was actually a benefit to the community. The financial investigation had more personal consequences for Brenda. Once the evidence of her shell company and the embezzled funds was turned over to the district attorney's office, criminal charges were inevitable. It turned out she had funneled over $40,000 from the HOA's accounts to herself in less than a year. She was charged with theft and fraud. The legal process dragged on for months, but with the paper trail being so clear, the outcome was never really in doubt. She pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, and had to complete 500 hours of community service. For me, vindication was complete. All the fines and the threatened lien were immediately nullified and expunged from the records by the new board. My legal fees were even reimbursed from the funds Brenda was forced to pay back. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was seeing the change in the neighborhood. The cloud of fear and suspicion that Brenda had cultivated lifted almost overnight. People started talking to each other again. The new HOA, under Arthur's gentle guidance, became what it was always supposed to be: a boring, functional organization that handled the essentials and otherwise left people alone. The new bylaws, drafted with input from the community and Ms. Albright's office, were a model of sensible, environmentally conscious governance. They didn't just tolerate my meadow, they celebrated it as an example for others. Within a year, several other neighbors had started their own smaller wildflower patches. Mrs. Gable's bird feeders were back up, and the new HOA even used funds to install a beautiful, high-end bird bath in her yard as a formal apology for how she'd been treated. The neighborhood was healing, becoming more connected and more beautiful than it had been before. A couple of years passed. Maple Creek Estates thrived. Property values, the thing Brenda had claimed to be protecting, actually went up as our neighborhood gained a reputation for being green and friendly. The community garden was a huge success, a place where neighbors gathered to trade tomatoes and stories. My landscaping business was doing better than ever, as people were now actively seeking out my expertise in native plantings. The meadow that had been the source of so much conflict was now the neighborhood's crown jewel. I did see Brenda one last time. It was about a year after her sentencing. I was picking up some supplies at a large nursery and garden center on the other side of town. As I was loading bags of mulch into my truck, I saw her. Her power suit was gone, replaced by the faded green apron of a store employee. Her helmet of hair was gone, replaced by a lank, stringy version of its former self. She was hauling a flat of marigolds, her face drawn and tired. Our eyes met for a brief second across the parking lot. I saw a flicker of recognition, followed immediately by a deep, weary shame. She quickly looked away and hurried inside. I didn't feel anger or even satisfaction. I just felt a quiet sense of pity. Her obsession with control, her petty tyranny, had cost her everything: her home, which she had to sell to pay the restitution, her reputation, and her pride. She had built a prison of rules for her neighbors and had ended up being the only one truly trapped by the consequences. I finished loading my truck and drove away, not looking back. The whole ordeal taught me a few valuable lessons. It taught me that bullies, no matter how much authority they project, are often propped up by nothing more than the apathy of those they seek to control. It taught me that a community is strongest when it stands together against unreasonable power. And it taught me that sometimes, the most effective weapon against a person obsessed with rules is to find a bigger, better rule they didn't know existed. Mostly, though, it reinforced what I already believed. That there is a strength and beauty in things that are a little wild, a little untamed. That a yard filled with life is infinitely better than a sterile green desert. My meadow is bigger now. It stretches across a larger portion of my yard, a testament to resilience. Every spring, when the first shoots of green push through the soil, I'm reminded of the fight. And every summer, when it explodes into a riot of color and the air hums with the sound of 1,000 tiny wings, I feel a deep, abiding sense of peace. I got to keep my flowers, and in the process, my neighbors and I got our community back. It was a victory that grew right out of the ground.